to this conversation that we really hadn't had represented before. And so Kirsten will share a little bit about more about who she is when it comes time for her to share. Next, we have Jenny Oliver, who is the Director of Operations and Social Equity Advancement, and she works at the Privilege Institute. And Jenny is 17 years of results-driven leadership and project management skills, and she does a fantastic job at the Privilege Institute. And the reason that I thought she was great for this is because she works as a white woman who is an active anti-racist white ally in the thick of it, and then she reports to an African-American leader, and how she talks about her role and what she sees and who she is in this work has always been wonderful to me. And so I thought that she would bring a great perspective to this conversation. And then we have Celestine Jeffries, who is actually the chief of staff of the office of the mayor here in Green Bay, and she has served under at least 2 mayors. And Celestine, I told somebody today, was one of the smartest people that I know, and so she is here because she obviously has touches with a number of different systems and professionals in the community. I thought she certainly would add something important to this conversation. And then last of all, but not least, we have Dr. Brenda Warren, who really plays that doctor stuff down, but she is a current member of our school board and has been the president of our school board. And I've had many conversations with her, and again, recognize that she has the perspective of a white anti-racist ally, and those are not that hard, easy to come by. And so I thought that she would make a contribution on this call, because she will speak from the perspective of someone that's been in the trenches working with one of the systems that actually has the greatest potential to make change in this country. And so thank you so much to our guests for being here. I'm Renita Robinson. I'm the CEO here at the YWC of Greater Green Bay, where our mission is a dedication to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. We're excited about this Where We Live series, and Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. may be joining us later, but this series was actually birthed out of a number of conversations we were having about what to do now that the murder of George Floyd actually was seen and a catalyst for conversations and real action that this country actually hasn't seen before. And we were in a conversation, and he was sharing something about another conversation that he was in, and he said something about Where We Live. I was like, that's it, Abby. We should call the series Where We Live. And so that's how this series was birthed, and it has been a great space for people in the community to listen and to feel safe as they process ideas and new information. And so thank you again for being here. And I will kind of be moderating this time together and giving our guests some opportunity just to reflect on some of the questions that are before us. And so the first question is really just us to hear a little bit about an experience in particular that helped you see disparity in the areas you're working in. And so on my screen, Jenny, you're first. If you wouldn't mind, would you lead us off and tell us a little bit about how you have seen disparity in working in kind of social justice work?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Renita, thank you so much for this work. And really my journey around inclusion and diversity work started back in 2004 when I became a new leader in the corporate world. And I had a lesbian woman reporting to me, and our business line was growing so quickly. And she had made a comment one day that every time we got a new team member, she felt like she had to come out all over again, explaining relationships of what pictures are on her desk, or if someone made an off comment before they realized her sexual orientation. And at that moment, I just knew that and that was a traumatic experience for her. So to think of her at her desk having trauma every time, how could she be engaged or productive at work? And so figuring out how to manage the culture within a diverse team, and have control and make sure it was welcoming. And it has been a 15-year journey where the last 5 years I've went from studying corporate engagement culture to white supremacy culture.
Wow.
Which is something I never grew up thinking I would do. Like, why would I be studying white supremacy culture? And so it's really hard for me to give you a one example time, because on this journey, I see it everywhere. I see it every day. I don't not see it. And so that's a really tough question. It can be to transportation. It can be in your policies at work. Do you have paternity leave versus maternity leave? How are you handling transgender bathrooms? How are those conversations happening? And really, as a society, we should be creating equitable practices that are safe for our most vulnerable citizens, whatever that looks like. So every day, my brain never shuts off. I am deeply ingrained in this work. It's not really work for me. It's my purpose and my way of life.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Captain Kirsten, you're second or next on my screen. Would you mind sharing with us kind of how you see disparities showing up in your workplace?
Sure. So it kind of started for me because I've grown up being a part of the Salvation Army, and so even from like a young age of observing things that were happening around me, like as a teenager, my family, we lived in the suburbs and we attended the church in the city, and so there I was witnessing differences, and in that case especially, like I was involved as a student in the education system, so my peers at church, our conversations kind of gave me like a broader picture of what it was like, depending on kind of a geographical, but there was also like a racial line there, of differences that we were experiencing. And then one of my first jobs with the Salvation Army was working at a homeless shelter in Chicago. And so there was a lot that I learned that year. And so my understanding during that time of like when I worked there was a lot of the people who were coming into the shelter were coming from the family public housing units that were being phased out in Chicago, that had been eliminated or drastically reduced. And so people were being relocated from the city to other places, just outside of the city in rural, like you'd have to take a train, like, or drive hours to get somewhere. And then here, and maybe this is like a question this might answer the question that's a little bit later, but I've kind of been seeing, like, since I moved to Green Bay, just kind of observing some differences here versus where I've lived in other places of things that people are comfortable saying in front of me, and then things that I have had people tell me have been said to them. And so like that's been very interesting to learn, and has just motivated me to try to figure out, like, you know, what's my role? What can I do to start dismantling these experiences like that people shouldn't have to be going through?
Thank you. Dr. Warren, you're next on my screen.
So like Jenny, I could come up with many different examples, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that I experienced actually very early in my tenure on the board. I've been on the board for 16 years. So these are examples that I think we've made progress in our district, and you know, some of the things that I saw 16 years ago, I wouldn't see today. Sorry, I have a...
Oh my goodness, sorry about that.
I have a brand new mouth appliance and it makes it hard for me to talk. And so anyway, a couple of things that came to mind. One of them is something that I've been paying attention to for a long time, and that's how we recognize our students. You know, we have awards banquets, and we have National Honor Society, and we have you know, cords that students wear at graduation. And I remember having a conversation when my one of my 3 boys was in middle school, and talking about the awards you know, event that they were having for students, and talking about how we're rewarding kids for getting good grades, but we're losing track of the fact that for some children, you know, like my own child, they don't have to worry about a lot of other things other than making sure they're doing what they need to for school. And then we have other children that have all sorts of responsibilities on their plates and all sorts of things that are going on in their lives that make it difficult for them to really be as successful as they could in school. And we're not rewarding them because they're not achieving A's. And yet, and I've said this many, many times to people, you know, that the student who has a C average, there are students that have C averages that have worked much, much harder to get those grades than my own child did, because they didn't have to worry about food or babysitting their siblings or, you know, becoming homeless and all of the things that our students struggle with. So I think we have worked hard to make sure that we are recognizing the effort that our students put forth, the improvements that they're making, finding ways to recognize all of that without just the, you know, the simple, here's your grade point and you either made the cut or you didn't. And another thing that has stuck with me for a long time, this was one, again, it was at one of my son's soccer games. And one of the rules was that you couldn't leave the stadium and come back. And so one of the team, one of the boys on my son's team had left to put his equipment in his car and wanted to come back in. And he still had a soccer uniform on, so it was very apparent that he was part of the team. And I have no idea what else may have been going on, but all I saw was the person just berating this young man and treating him in a way that I just was very bothered by that. And the first thought that came to my mind when I was watching that was, would she talk to my son like that if he had left to put his stuff in his car and was trying to come back in? And I think that's, and again, I don't say this to criticize people. I mean, I know everybody's on a journey, and again, this was probably 12 years ago, and I think a lot of people have journeyed forward enough that those kinds of things wouldn't happen again. But you know, those are just the little things I think that happen, aside from the big systemic kinds of decisions that we make. Those are the kinds of things that stick with me and help ground me in why we're doing the work we do.
And Brenda, was that student different? How was that student different?
I'm sorry, yeah, this was a Hispanic student.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I should have made that clear.
No problem. Celestine.
Thanks, Nita. Thanks, everybody. You know, I think if you are a person who cares about your community, you're actually on the lookout for disparity. And so, you know, throughout my entire life and lots of places that I've worked, you know, one of the most obvious areas of disparity is in hiring. So pretty much everywhere I've worked, I think that those entities really try very hard to hire a diverse workforce and struggle with that. And that's no less true for Green Bay Public Schools, where I was a school board member, the chamber, where I worked for a little bit, 4 years, part-time, and also with the city, just to name the places I've worked in Green Bay. And I think part of the issue is that, you know, we create job descriptions for people we have in mind. And when we do those interviews, we have those people in our mind. And so I think in order to uncover, where I see a lot of disparity in our community, it's really in hiring, and lots of other communities struggle with that. We're not the only one. And so that's kind of the thing that we talk about at City Hall and senior staff, is trying to unpack some of that. But I would say most recently, the areas where I thought we had everything together is with ADA accessibility. So obviously we're the government and the city of Green Bay, and we have a lot that we have to give information to the federal government. We have standards on our own standards, and we have to really assess that every year. And a friend of mine came to a council meeting. Maybe, boy, time is kind of odd these days. I think it was maybe at the end of 2018. She came to a council meeting and sat in the council chambers in her device. And she's like, yeah, Celestine, these chambers are not ADA accessible. And I was like, what? They're not? Which really just caused me to look at, some of our committee rooms. I mean, obviously we have an elevator in City Hall. We do have a entrance for people who have different abilities in the front. But I hadn't looked really I had not looked through the eyes of someone who needed an assistive device to get around. And I sat in that council chambers for years. And so, as I said in the beginning, I think if you're a thinking person, you're on the lookout for disparities. I had no idea we had this. So the end of the story is, I just recently got rid of it's the pews in the council chambers. So I just recently got rid of them. And now we have chairs. And we have ordered chairs that, so we have chairs without arms, and we'll have chairs with arms, and we'll also have chairs like in the doctor's office that are a little higher for people who can't sit and have their knees at a 90-degree angle. So that's just the beginning for us, at least in terms of committee rooms. One more thing too, like I said, on lookout for disparity. We have had some employees who have transitioned, and once again, that caused me to ask everyone, so what's the bathroom situation where you are? So at City Hall, every floor has a bathroom that is gender neutral, just because it also happens to be the accessible bathroom. But just asking like PD, which is complicated, fire, there are 7 fire stations, transit, which is a newer building, water utility, which is going to have an upgrade, and then our park shelters. What's the gender neutral bathroom situation? So even asking a question, I think, provokes a conversation. Not all these things can be fixed easily because some of them take finances, that we don't always have. But I would say those are the 2 areas that, for someone like me, who I think I'm pretty aware and with it. But these are things I've learned in the last few years that I wasn't quite really aware of before.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And so when we're on a call like this and people start to share, a webinar like this and people start to share, there are all of these things that connect, right? And so we saw that the kind of race piece kind of came to the fore, but then also just this whole idea of like, what are we paying attention to and what jumps out at us as needing to be addressed so that people can have like this equitable existence and that kind of thing. I think on the one of our last webinars, we talked about the whole idea of affirmative action. And so when you talk about hiring being one of those places where there's disparity, like you have to have the conversation about affirmative action. And I certainly have some thoughts about affirmative action because I think that what people think about it isn't really the accurate picture of it. Affirmative action isn't, what affirmative action is not, is giving jobs to people who are not qualified. right? But what affirmative action is giving people an opportunity to jobs who wouldn't otherwise have opportunities. And Dr. Warren talked about like the award ceremony, right? And so they were giving people awards based on their grades. And so the people that got the most awards were people that had all of these higher grades, but something, grit actually didn't factor into that, because some of the people that have barriers and experience discrimination and experience a ton of other things, it took them a lot more work to get that C than it took the purple to get that A, but that's not factoring in when you're in a hiring situation, right? Because that A got them access to some Ivy League schools. That grade, that those A's got them access to things that then that same candidate or that candidate going for that job market simply didn't have access to, because en route to getting the accoutrements that it took to get accepted into that institution, they had barriers, right? And so I'm curious to know your reaction to that, because when we talk about going from the macro issues about how racism in systems affects people's opportunities to the micro situation, you have to get that affirmative action is basically saying the standard for the job is this, and all of those people have met the standard, but let's this time not give it to the one that met the standard because they had all A's, but let's give it to the person that met the standard and actually had a different kind of experience getting to that standard. Anybody want to respond to that?
I definitely will. Just from a hiring and business perspective, you're right. Every position is posted out there with a list of here's your most qualified candidate. We shouldn't have an idea in our mind of what they look like. But we know that there's so many studies out there that prove just looking at the disparities of a resume, how many people are disqualified because of their name, or because of the city that's on there, or what part of the city that's on there. Start dating when you went back to school. You start putting dates on there and people are gonna start thinking, whoa, this person's really old. It's an older person. They have all these biases in their mind that maybe they're not good on technology and they won't be able to keep up and this isn't the right culture. And so it's little microaggressions that show up everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Others?
But I think too, getting back to the school situation, I think that it starts in school, because it's not only are you building your resume, so to speak, while you're in school, you're also internalizing the messages that you're receiving from people around you. And if people aren't acknowledging your grit or your effort or your improvement, and all they're acknowledging is the end point, then you're missing that opportunity to help build that student, to build their confidence, to build their knowledge of themselves, that yes, I am capable and I do deserve to apply for this job. Because I just wonder sometimes, even within the affirmative action world, if there are jobs that some people just don't even apply for, because they haven't had those experiences of people valuing them for what they bring to the classroom or bring to the workplace and those kinds of things.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, and so the next question, what policies, and we've alluded to some of these, what policies are you familiar with that perpetuates the problems caused by racism? And so lack of access to job opportunities, one, but what are some of the other policies that you think are caused by racism?
Well, it's a long list, right? That perpetuate problems caused by racism. You know, so in Wisconsin, and Brendan knows, Brendan was actually there. We were recounting this little encounter we had with the Americans for Prosperity. And it was a session where we talked about lots of different things. And one of the things we talked about was school vouchers, right? And so school vouchers were supposed to be something for parents who are low to moderate income to be able to send their children via public dollars to private schools. And doing that would level the playing field, because it would give them, the ability to go to the schools that are more competitive, that provide, better education, and then get them on their way. So one thing that was interesting with the entities that support school vouchers is that they completely overlook the uniqueness of Wisconsin, in that no student in Wisconsin is bound by their zip code for school. We have open enrollment, which is beautiful. Now, the problem with open enrollment is that you then rely on the parent's ability to transport the child to the school. There are other caveats, which I think the details of which are not totally the topic of today's conversation, but there is that opportunity in the public school system for students, for parents who feel that their schools are not what they want their children to be in, that they can send their children to another school. And so the school voucher program, though, is one of those really interesting ones, because on the surface, it seems very fair, very egalitarian, right? But what's underneath is really perpetuating a lot of stereotypes, it's perpetuating people really not having access to these opportunities. And really and truly, what we need to do is to make our public schools better funded, to get more programs, more teachers who look like the students, more teachers who are qualified. That's what we need more of in order to make our society more egalitarian, not to put students in a different system that may not actually treat them very well. And so, that's one of the new ones that I think, like I said, on the surface seems really great, but underneath, not so much.
I think one of the policies that was just, I think, phasing out 16 years ago when I first got on the board was zero tolerance policies for behavior. And I think we don't have those anymore. But I still see remnants of the feelings that went behind the zero tolerance policy in terms of how people want the district, or how people think the district and administrators should approach behavior for students. And we've worked very hard to change our approaches to behavior. I think zero tolerance policies remove the ability for people who know students well in a school to be able to work with that student to figure out, there's always a root cause behind students' behaviors. And with the zero tolerance policy, you lose that ability to really work with students to figure out what those root causes are, how to help them, how to, all sorts of ways to help them not have those behaviors that interfere with their learning and the learning of others in their classroom, and just the school itself. So that's something that we, even though we don't have a zero tolerance policy, I still see us working against the impulse. And up until this last year, I still hear people in our community or people in our schools that just want us to, discipline the child and suspend them and that kind of thing. And they we're still working to get everybody on board with the idea of being patient and understanding, and then working with that child, not accepting the behavior, but working with the child, because that's part of school. You know, we teach reading and arithmetic and social studies and all those kinds of things. I think also our role is helping a student learn how they interact with the world, and help them do that in a way that's more constructive as they move forward.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Just a few things that I have on that, and especially someone who is a product of the Green Bay school system. Teachers, I don't think always recognize that the language that they use is super harmful. And students I've seen carry that into the workplace. Specifically, I had, as I was coaching and helping one of my associates practice mock interviews for another role. And I'm like, oh, just, work on this, but it was good. She's like, it was good? I'm like, yeah. She's like, I always get so nervous for job interviews because my high school teacher told me I was the worst interview he's ever had. And my personal experience is I can go back to an incident that happened with me and a teacher in 7th grade. And the words she said to me were so harmful, I literally carried them with me for 30 years until I had the tools to unpack what she said and understand that what she said was racist. The good thing about Green Bay being a small town is I had the opportunity last summer to sit down with this teacher and have a conversation.
Wow.
And it was beyond powerful and liberating for me. And she didn't remember the words that she said to me. And that was okay, but it also had to do with boys of color in my class. And as soon as I mentioned some of the boys' names, she literally said, I failed them.
Wow.
I failed them because I didn't have the tools 30 years ago. And that meant more to me than anything. But really understanding 30 years, 30 years of that messaging, and she doesn't even remember the conversation. So teachers have so much power.
Right.
And if that's what's happening to me, I can't imagine what's happening to our marginalized students. And we have to stop looking at those marginalized students from a deficit model.
Right.
Because for me, no one in my family even graduated high school. And people came to me in high school and said, I'm at risk. No one talked to me about being a first generation high school graduate, let alone a college graduate. And imagine the difference that may have had on my whole school experience and growing up.
Wow. Powerful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And so we are not often in the conversation of talking about cultural adds when difference is involved. We look at it as deficit. We look at anything that's not what is held as normal or right as the standard, and then anything that's separate from that is some kind of way costing right or costing the standard. And it's, instead we need to be reframing how we're thinking about the diversity that is here in Green Bay and that will continue to grow. Last year that we were actually minority in our schools, and we know that diversity is growing across our community, and we have to shift our language into talking more about cultural adds and what are these differences and this diversity, what is it adding to us? Thank you so much for all of those answers. So we know at the YWC that invariably we're all connected, right? We're connected on a variety of levels. You guys have started to see some interconnectivity in terms of experiences that shaped how you think, who you are, and that kind of thing. I'm curious to know, how uncomfortable are you willing to be to make contributions to the health of a different area of this community or one area of this community? Because what we know is that it's easy to have a conversation about I'm going to empower people. it's much more difficult to have a conversation about I'm going to privilege people, and privileging people really comes at a cost to the person that is sharing or trying to give or open up privilege to other people. So I'm curious, some of you all are working it, so you're already answering it by the work that you do, but how uncomfortable are you willing to be to actually make a contribution to the health of a different area, to the health of this community?
So I think I'll start. I didn't answer the last question because I'm not too familiar with actual policies, but this one, I really like this question, but I don't know, I don't know how best to answer it, to be honest, to be honest about how uncomfortable I'm willing to be. I think part of discomfort for me is just even saying something out loud that I think, being willing to speak up and break the white solidarity, which is, a friend had sent me a video where the person was talking about being in a situation where someone makes a racist comment, and then the person who was making the video is a white person, and they were talking about they have a choice whenever that happens, they can be a part of what they were calling the white solidarity, or they can speak up and break that. And because I think just to give maybe a couple of anecdotes about things that have happened here in Green Bay in the past year that I've been here. First of all, I got really excited about the Black Lives Matter marches that were happening in Green Bay. And so I was talking about it in a church context. I was really passionate about participating in a Black Lives Matter march as a Christian and a person of faith. But as I was talking about it and getting all excited in my church setting, someone who was hearing me talk, and someone who is a white person, said the statement, "They don't want us there." And so that was kind of it was revealing that there was an assumption being made that there's a they, and it's for them to handle this or to take down the racism in our world. But what I've been reading and hearing and has been stirred up in me lately is that it's something that white people need to address and handle, because in our culture, in our country, in our community, white people are the people who have the power, socially, politically, economically. And so my understanding as a Christian is informed by Philippians chapter 2, which describes that Jesus gave up his rights and his power and became humble. And so although I'm not going to say that white people are Jesus, because I even at just thinking about it, I'm okay, this could sound the wrong way. I do not want to say, because I think the difference is Jesus had the right to have the power, whereas white people have taken it have taken it and held on to it and fought for it, which is not that's not how things are supposed to be. And but it does require that acknowledging that when this change happens, as this change happens, it is a real change. It's not just oh yeah, I'm gonna think a different thought about someone. It's the structures will change, and there's a real cost to dismantling white supremacy and those things. There's a real cost, and as a Christian, I believe that I am called to pay that cost. I'm called to give up what I can, and so I suppose that is going to be really uncomfortable, and I don't know yet what that looks like, but I think that's what I'm called to do. So that was my thoughts on that question at this time.
Thank you, Kirsten. Any reactions, thoughts, or anybody want to answer the question more?
Yeah, I think that, as Kirsten says, humility is key. right? Because if you're humble, first of all, you open yourself up to others, and then you also begin to recognize what privileges you actually have. And of course, there are many different privileges that we bestow on our neighbors. Many privileges. You know, Jenny talked about the privilege of living in a small town where you literally could talk, like call up your old teacher and have a conversation. And Brenda was talking about the privilege of getting awards when you're in school and being recognized by people who are in authority. And Kirsten's talking about really the privilege of having faith, right? It's hard to have faith. And so there are many privileges. One of the things that I think about when I think about being brave is that you have to, so I'm sort of equating bravery with discomfort, right?
Okay.
Because you have to, in order to allow yourself to be uncomfortable, you have to be brave to allow that. And so you have to practice that, right? You have to practice it.
Totally.
So, I'm sorry?
She said totally.
Yeah.
Agree
Yeah.
with Celestine. And I just to add on to that is, I heard the great Dr. Harry Broad once say, don't confuse discomfort for safety. And so if it's not safe for you to speak up in that moment, don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
But don't confuse the two. And so we've been ingrained that conflict is a bad thing. So it's always going to be uncomfortable to speak up and intervene. And so white silence equals violence right now. Like really going off of Ibram Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. You're either anti-racist or you're not.
Right.
To today's topic point, you're part of the problem or you're part of the solution. And even 15 years into doing this work and really studying different scholars, I can go from a racist thought to being consciously anti-racist. But growing up on the west side of Green Bay and looking at to move to the east side of Green Bay, what does that mean? Where does that BS come from? How do I unpack that? What lessons did my parents teach me? Like, it's ridiculous things, but constantly being aware of the thoughts that pop in your head and where do they come from?
Mm-hmm.
But the discomfort and safety, don't confuse the two.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I think, Jenny, I've had a lot of those similar kinds of thoughts, and I heard Dr. Shiraki Hawley in a seminar a month ago say something like, don't let your last thought be the same as your first thought. Yeah. And I thought that was really sort of how I've tried to work through my unconscious biases, my, all of those things that are part of me is you may have a bias that pops up as your first reaction, but if you allow yourself to work through that and realize where that bias is coming from, and then have your last thought be something that's better than what your first thought was. So I really like that. And I would, in terms of being uncomfortable, I have certainly been in a lot of conversations with people that are making racist kinds of remarks about our students in our schools, and they're different conversations depending on, again, I think to your point, Celestine, the humility of the person that you're talking to. And there are certain people that are absolutely certain of their rightness in what they're saying, and if I challenge them, it seems like all I'm doing is increasing their certainty of why they're right, because they keep coming back at me with their reasons. And that's it. And yet, and on the flip side, I've had lots of conversations with people who are still on a, on that journey and really working and reflecting. And when you challenge certain things, or you try to, ask them to clarify things like that, they, they tend not to be defensive, and they listen and take in what you're saying and process it through the work that they're doing. But the other conversations that I've had with people that are so sure that they're right, that's an area where I still am working and looking, and I have the Candy's book on my list. I'm hoping that book will kind of help give me some examples. But I remember somebody else, and it may have been in one of these where you live things, somebody saying that how important it is to just practice saying the words out loud. That when you're not, when you're by yourself, so that the words that you're saying come off of your tongue, naturally and more easily. But I'd be interested if anybody else has any insight into how to have those conversations with people that are just resistant to listening to any other frame of or any other perspective on it.
Well, I think, I would hope that we're all on a journey, right? We're all on some journey. And just as you said, Brenda, what your first thought or the way you started your week is not the way that you end it. A couple of things that I always look to. I always look to the people who are in my life who can tell me the truth, right? But at the same time, the people who love me, so that they can, and this is something my husband is exploring, so they can give me the credit of love. So with them, my credit is always good. It's always endless, right? My credit score is perfect. And I can actually stretch myself and explore the boundaries of what I'm feeling, what I am not comfortable with, so I can expose it, bring it to the surface, and fix it, right? So I think that's one aspect of being uncomfortable and living with discomfort, is that you have to have people around you with whom you can be yourself and they can help you. The other thing that I think is really important, and this is just what I see, and maybe because, I talk to a lot of people whose minds are not going to be changed, treating them with dignity and respect, and trying to find, this is my kind of new thing in the last couple of years, trying to find that kernel of truth in what they're saying, right? Not everybody has that kernel of truth, but most people do. Even if you're disagreeing with them, even if they're saying something you're like, oh my gosh, you completely do not understand anything you're talking about. But maybe there's that little kernel of truth. And then that kernel is where I build the foundation of my bridge to that person. Obviously, also, the other caveat is, what kind of relationship do I have with that person? If it's like a work where I'm actually trying to solve an issue as a chief of staff, then that's one type of relationship. If I'm in a deeper relationship with that person, I'm going to demand more. There was someone I know who had kind of a slip up, and so I said to this person, listen, I just got to let you know, you sounded racist right there. And this person was like, did I? And I'm like, yeah, you did. Let me explain. But we have that relationship where that person trusts me to say that to that person, so that it's a message of repair. It's a message of, I'm still here for you. We're still buds, right? And then you can hear that message more easily if you're coming from that vantage point. But if you're not in that kind of relationship with the person, then like I said, I look for that kernel of truth on which I can build my bridge to the person. It's tough though.
Yeah.
It's tough. Yeah. And I'm not from the Midwest, so I'm not always nice.
Right, right. I think the other piece of that, thank you all for those comments. I think the other piece of that is when all else fails, and if you can't find the kernel of truth, you can just be honest about what you believe, right? And so, you know, these are my feelings or these are my thoughts, and at least you haven't been silent, because when you're silent, they think you agree. If you're in a conversation that's racially charged and people are saying things that are really problematic, if you don't say, oh, I don't think that way, they think you agree. So in the worst case scenario, if you can simply say, oh, I don't experience that like that, just say something so that they know that you're not agreeing with them. And so that's a huge tool. Yeah, so thank you. This is pretty great. So there is on this particular panel a range of kind of years in Green Bay, and we know that things are changing. Like we talked about the majority minority in the schools. We talked about some different legislation that's happening. We know that we are getting ready to have a position at the city on diversity and inclusion. Could you guys tell me a little bit about how you have experienced the communities changing and its response to the fact that there is more diversity and conversations that more diversity is needed? Tell us how long you've been here and then answer that, please.
I have been here my whole entire life, like literally born at St. Vincent's Hospital and have lived pretty much on the west side my whole life. But what I love to see changing is people having the conversation, people saying the word white privilege. You know, as a person who took a job a year ago, and as part of my job as the white woman is to promote the white privilege conference. And so going up to people and saying, hey, have you heard about the white privilege conference? Coming from a white woman looks very different than if Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. is at the table with me. And so figuring out how to present that, right? Like that's my brand, that's my business, that's what I'm selling as a white woman. And so the temperature's changed. I can have those conversations in more places. And it's nice to hear other people acknowledging that it's real. And just totally want to be clear that at the White Privilege Conference, we're not just talking about white privilege, we're talking about all forms of privilege. And so my first response to people is the fact that I'm standing here talking to you today comes with many privileges. We probably traveled to be here because I'm usually at a conference. That's a privilege. I'm standing, I can hear you, I'm speaking, we're speaking the same language. There's so many privileges just in that moment. And so let's start there.
Thank you.
I've lived here for 31 years. Grew up in Wisconsin. I moved to Wisconsin when I was in first grade, and went away to college and post-grad training and things like that, but then came back 31 years ago. And I would say, again, I would echo Jenny. I think, you know, the conversations have changed. I think the fear of you know, our changing community in terms of demographics has lessened somewhat. But I still, when my oldest, who's now 30, started middle school, he went to, all my kids went to Washington Middle School and East High School. And this is an experience, and Celestine's kids high school, I hear the same kinds of experiences, but when you send your child to a school like that, you get all sorts of interesting comments about, you know, it's such a bad school, and why would you send your kids there? I'd never send my kids there, all those kinds of things. And you know, and so I've been put in the situation of you know, sort of having to defend my reasons and talking about what a wonderful place that was for my kids to go to school, and the diversity of thought and experience, and you know, the teachers were so great, and there was such a sense of community and all of those kinds of things. And it, you know, every school has different things that aren't exactly right, but it, you know, it was definitely a great place for my kids to go to school. I still hear that. And I was listening to a webinar by Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, and she made a comment, and I'd never put this in perspective like this. The comment she said was, why do we talk about good schools? And the definition of a good school is our schools that don't have students of color or a lot of poor students in the school. That is still a very common thought, I think, amongst people, and not just in Green Bay. I mean, you hear those kinds of comments all over the country, but you know, I just really, that, you know, I've never felt like, you know, my kids were going to a bad school, but I hear that from so many people, and I just wonder how to reframe that sense of you know, what makes a school good or bad. And it kind of goes back to your voucher point, Celestine, of, you know, that's the same conversation cycles through that every voucher conversation you have is, I want my kids to go to a good school, and, you know, what is that definition? So that was just an interesting, you know, I've been noodling that comment for the last month or so.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? I'm looking at the time and we have just 3 minutes left. So I want to wrap up first by saying thank you all so much. Thank you so much for being here. There will be other opportunities and extensions of this conversation. And so visit us often, and then visit our website for the recordings, because the live recordings are available if you click on to the Where We Live series on the YWCA website. We also have some other things that are coming up. We know that there is another Where We Live on July 25th, and it is going to focus on the resources that are available. And we will have our partner, the Privilege Institute, back, and some other folks in the community that are doing work in this area. We have another installment of No Wrong Thing happening on Monday, the 27th. And then we offered a few movies and books for you guys to consider looking into. The Netflix series 13th, When They See Us, books stamped from the beginning, Waking Up White Fragility, and we had a couple more resources that were shared during this time that we've been together. We have just 2 minutes later, so I want to just allow maybe, you know, just a quick wrap up if anybody felt like they didn't say something that they really felt like they wanted to say during this time. If you could just kind of use a minute or so to wrap that up. So we'll probably only have time for one of those. So would anybody like to say anything?
I just think that I think
Is it like that on yours too?
patience and humility are really important for the people that are pro that just need to honor everyone's place in the journey and help them, you know, move forward.
Thank you. You actually went underwater for us. Would you mind saying that once more, Brenda? You went underwater for a second.
I just feel like, as Celestine said, humility is so important, and I also think patience. I think everybody's in a different place in this journey, and trying to help people, you know, move forward by having good, courageous conversations and just being patient with everybody as we travel this journey together.
Yes, indeed. And I just want to remind us, we're all connected. Some kind of way we're all connected. And if we start to reframe the conversations about diversity and inclusion and racism, and have an understanding that all of us are experiencing it, and we just have to make a decision to make the best out of all of it. And so thank you again, my panelists, for your time here. And please visit our website often. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.